Hi, good evening. So tonight I'd like to tell you a quick story about our space, the Concrete Garden. It started in 2010 as a vacant site in Postle Park, just up the road. So it's a story about what can happen when people come together around place-based projects and about the experiences that people can have. There's a huge amount of potential in spaces like this. And John Holloway talks about working in the cracks in neoliberal capitalist society. And community gardens established on vacant land are very much both spatial and metaphorical cracks. They're spaces where people can make a choice to be and do things differently. Rather than recreating the dominant unequal hierarchical structures of society, they can create a different set of values and do things differently. So the garden's developed from this dead space to one which is very much alive. It's ever evolving. And as you'll see, it's a space which means something different to everyone who's involved. So this is a story about community. The garden is, first of all, a community of people. People who come together to enjoy working alongside one another, to have fun, to celebrate, to relax and unwind. And importantly, it's also a space to grow. So the garden is abundant with a huge range of vegetables, herbs, and fruit. And it creates the possibility of access to local organic produce in an area where often this is just not an option, either because there aren't local shops that are providing fresh produce, or because the higher cost of organic produce just eliminates this for a lot of people. So in urban environments, we've become so disconnected from where our food comes from. Community gardens can become places where we start to reconnect with this. And in our garden, people experience the joy of getting their hands in the dirt and growing their own. And the food that we grow is shared out amongst everybody who gets involved. We regularly harvest and prepare and eat together. And this sharing of food creates a real sense of togetherness and conviviality on which our garden thrives. As folk come together to eat and to chat and to share the literal fruits of their labour. So the garden is also a place to connect to each other, to our food, and through this there's also a growing awareness of the non-human community which we're all part. By spending time in a garden, people begin to recognise their place in the wider ecological community, and they recognise our dependence on all of this. We become more aware of the interconnectedness between human activity and that of the natural world, and nowhere is this more obvious than in a garden. We depend on the natural community and our compost heap to help us keep our soil fertile, and we depend on pollinators like bees to help us produce all of our food. And over the last couple of years, we've found the garden has become more and more alive. And we've worked together to create a space which is welcoming to both its human and non-human animals. We've created new wildlife spaces, and we've also created a home for a lovely wee flock of hens, and they really do brighten up the day of everybody who visits the garden. So working in the garden, we're growing food and plants, but we're also growing as people. And we're growing as a community. We're learning. We're learning how to grow our own. We're learning about one another. We're learning about ourselves. And we're also learning new ways of doing things that can be beneficial for our own well-being, but they're also beneficial for the health of our planet. And this act of growing together and creating a garden can be really powerful. To see the seeds that you have sown germinate, and to care and nurture something and to see it flourish can be an incredible experience. And one in an urban environment is far too rare. So it's a chance to reconnect. And Richard Sennett talks about homo faber, human as maker. And I think this is a part of ourselves that's so easily forgotten in a society where culture privileges a really limited form of creation, this kind of self-creation through a really narrow framework of consumption. Through these shared projects and experiences, people discover a more powerful form of creativity. They become aware of their ability to affect change in the world around them. We learn how to cooperate, and in a world where we're too often taught to compete and compare, this is a craft that we really need to relearn. And these things all seem to become more possible in a space that feels really different to your typical cityscape. There's a really interesting relationship between public and private in these spaces. It's at the same time a place to escape and unwind, but it's also a place of action and a place in common. As Viv says, there are good vibes in the garden. There's a growing of confidence and empowerment, and a change in the ways we relate to one another. A part of this feeling, I think, is down to the different aesthetic in the garden. It's one of creativity and possibility and spontaneity. It's a place where people can begin to assert their right to shape their spaces and communities in a context where public space is quietly being eroded. These can become spaces of resistance to dominant values and ways of living, often for folk who have been really marginalised and let down by our current socio-economic system. And yes, whilst it might be naive to suggest that spaces like this alone are currently significantly shifting the balance of power, what they are doing is giving folk the space to recognise that they can do things for themselves. And this can become a catalyst for action and a move towards social self-determination. And we do this also by connecting to other groups, creating partnerships all the time through local food events and international exchanges and workshops, participating in a broad-based movement for social and environmental justice. So ultimately, this space for me embodies so much in a context where to make this happen is for folk to go against the grain, the dominant logic of capital, competition, hierarchy, dehumanising and unequal socioeconomic structures. The garden is a physical manifestation of cooperation and community, determination, love and nurture. And I think for me, that's fairly radical stuff.